There are places for our dead, places of peace and not dread, sites of simple or elaborate stones that memorialize our lost ones' bones. Welcome to Stones and Bones. Welcome to Stones and Bones.
Hello, you spectacular people. Welcome to Stones and Bones number 7. I am your host, Diane.
And this is Kelly.
Kelly, on this episode, we're going to be talking about ye old burying grounds.
All right. On this Stones and Bones, we are focusing specifically on the cemeteries that named themselves Old Burying Ground. These old burying grounds offer a snapshot of what life was like during the Colonial Period in America. And they don't use the term cemetery in the name because the term wasn't in use yet. Garden cemeteries were a couple hundred years away from being planned, so many of these cities of the dead are haphazard and wild. And they were never considered hallowed, but rather common. Many of them are filled with notable people from American history. Let's look at a few of them.
We're going to head to Cambridge first. The old burying ground here is located across the street from Harvard Yard and was founded in 1635 at the edge of Cambridge Common. Little fun fact, Kelly. Harvard Yard has that yard in the name because this was once a cow yard.
Oh.
So, you've got all those Ivy Leaguers who are going to Harvard. Now you can just say, are you stepping in cow patties while you're doing it?
Are ya bleep kickers? Shizzle kickers?
Mood.
This was part of a new European settlement that was called Newtown, and it had an E at the end of that, next to the Charles River. The name changed to Cambridge in 1638. This was actually the second official public burying ground. The first was overrun by wolves and abandoned because, it's not very safe to go visit the family member and put a little flower or whatever when you got wolves coming in. No one knows where it is to this day. That's how abandoned it was. The first burial in the old burying ground took place 5 years after Newtown was established. Burials continued here all the way up until the early 1900s, but only for family members of those already in the cemetery. There are at least 1,200 burials that are marked, but hundreds more are believed to be here. The oldest tombstone is for Anne Arrington, who died in 1653 at the age of 77. Many tombstones feature the memento mori images of death, so they're very cool. Many table tombs conceal a flight of steps and a vault underground with shelves on the sides.
7 former presidents of Harvard College are buried here. Henry Dunster was Harvard's first president. He was born in England and became the first president after the newly founded college dismissed the first master, Nathaniel Eaton, because he was mistreating students. Dunster supervised the first building that was built for the college, and he established the charter in 1650. The president was eventually ousted because he wouldn't baptize his infant son. He passed away in 1659 and is buried under a gray table tomb. There is a plot that Harvard owns and maintains that has both faculty and students, because back in the day, particularly when smallpox came through, it was hard to get the bodies back to their homes.
Benjamin Wadsworth was an American clergyman who trained at Harvard College and was minister for the First Church in Boston. He became a president of Harvard as well. His home still stands in Cambridge and is known as Wadsworth House. This is the second oldest building at Harvard and eventually served as General George Washington's headquarters from July 2nd to the 16th in 1775. The house would be home for 9 Harvard presidents and then a boarding house for students, one of whom was Ralph Waldo Emerson. Wadsworth died in 1737 and was buried here.
John Leverett served in a variety of capacities. It's easiest to just share his epitaph written by William Thaddeus Harris. John Leverett was the grandson of Governor Leverett. He graduated at Harvard College in 1680 and was a tutor in this institution. He was a representative, Speaker of the House, a member of His Majesty's Council, a justice of the Superior Court, and a judge of probate. He was chosen president of Harvard College and inducted into office January 14, 1708, in which station he remained till his sudden death, May 3, 1724. President Leverett has been represented as a man of vast learning and true piety. His talents were eminently practical. He knew better than most men what course to shape in difficult times, and how political and religious factions were to be managed or controlled.
That's like a miracle. He knew how to control both political and religious factions.
In all his official relations, his industry, vigor, and fidelity were conspicuous and exemplary.
I'd say they liked the guy. William Thaddeus Harris was a graduate of Harvard College and was a paraplegic due to a curvature in his spine. He loved history and the epitaphs in the cemetery, so he recorded them in his book, Epitaphs from the Old Burying Ground in Cambridge, with Notes, that was published in 1845. It's a good thing he did that because many of them would be lost if he hadn't done that. At the time he wrote the book, the burial ground was suffering neglect, and he wrote, "It is rather surprising that in this age of improvement, Cambridge should fall behind her neighbors and suffer her ancient graveyard to lie neglected. Many of the tombs are without the names of the owners. Many of the gravestones have been broken, and more are broken every year. Brambles abound instead of shrubbery, and what might be a beautiful cemetery is converted into a common passageway. Unfitting is it indeed that the sod beneath which rest the ashes of a shepherd, a Dunster, and a Michael should be rioted over by every vagrant schoolboy." In other words, stop walking through the graveyard.
Reverend Edward Holyoake was the 9th president of Harvard, a college that he himself attended and graduated from when he was 16.
Wow.
Yeah, impressive. It was said of Holyoake that he, quote, had the distinction, as an undergraduate, of having more fines and black marks recorded against his name for breaches of discipline than any student of his day.
And he became a reverend.
Well, he was still a pretty young punk, so maybe that's why.
That's true.
If he graduated at 16.
That's true.
He didn't care for the strict tenets of Calvinism and was a liberal spokesperson in both politics and religion, preaching tolerance. This was in the early 1700s. He would be married 3 times, having all 3 wives die before he passed in 1769. A little fun fact, maybe, about him is his considerable girth, which got him the nickname from students of Guts. He served as Harvard president for 32 years.
Appleton Chapel at Harvard is named for Nathaniel Appleton, who graduated from Harvard in 1712. He served as minister at First Church in Cambridge for 66 years and was chaplain at the First Revolutionary Provisional Congress in 1774. He died in 1784 at the age of 91. It always amazes me when people live into their 90s way back then. Edward Wigglesworth graduated. I love that last name. What's your name, kid? Wigglesworth. Edward Wigglesworth graduated from Harvard in 1710 and became the first divinity professor in the colonies. His first wife died a year after they married, and this was described without issue. And so I was like, what does that mean, without issue? Like, does it just mean that she passed away without anybody taking care of her? I didn't know what that meant, but apparently back at that time, it meant you died without having any children.
Oh, okay.
So if you see that on a tombstone, that's what that means. He was buried in a crypt here at the burial ground in 1765.
Poet Richard Henry Dana was born in 1787 in Cambridge. He attended Harvard and became a lawyer, but rarely practiced. Dana enjoyed the poetry more and said Harvard smothered genius. He also wrote fiction and adopted the Gothic genre into that, as it was just coming onto the scene. He made only $400 over 30 years with his writing. Dana died in 1879.
A poem on a grave here reads, "Pale ghastly death hath sent its shaft, and hath by chance nigh broke our heart. Death's volley sound, sad storms appear, morning draws on, poor Harvard fear. Least's sad stroke should be a sign of sudden future death to thine."
Some of the presidents had slaves, and there were a couple of burials here that reflect that fact. One burial is a small slate stone with the well-known skull and wings, and it reads, "Here lies the body of Cicely, Negro, late servant to the Reverend Minister William Brattle. She died April 8, 1714, being 15 years old." Another burial reads, "Jane, a Negro servant to Andrew Boardman, Esquire, died 1740 or 41, aged 22 years and 3 months.
Yeah, it was just weird. It has it 1740/1, but then they also have age 22 years. So I'm like, well, you had to be kind of sure about when that was. There are burials here for Revolutionary War soldiers who died during the Battle of Bunker Hill. This includes Cato Stedman and Neptune Frost, who were black soldiers of the Continental Army. They were buried quickly, and so their burials were unmarked until baking powder magnate Eben Horsford decided to locate them. And by locate, we mean he literally dug up the remains and identified them by their Minutemen garb.
Oh my.
I mean, he really wanted to give them a memorial, I guess. I can't imagine going out there and I'm going to dig them up and just make sure they've got those uniforms on. A monument was later placed in that part of the burial ground. The last couple burials in the cemetery were for Reverend Samuel McCord Crothers in 1924 and Gardner Day all the way up into 1981, who was the minister of Christ Church. A renovation of the cemetery took place in the 1930s and it was re-landscaped. Burials don't continue here anymore. Next, we're going to go over to Sleepy Hollow, one of our favorite places, and this is a old burying ground that we've been to, the Old Dutch Burying Ground.
The Old Dutch Burying Ground is situated next to the Old Dutch Church in Sleepy Hollow. The novel, Legend of Sleepy Hollow, describes the burying ground like this. Indeed, certain of the most authentic historians of those parts, who have been careful in collecting and collating the floating facts concerning this specter, allege that the body of the trooper having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in nightly quest of his head, and that the rushing speed with which he sometimes passes along the hollow, like a midnight blast, is owing to his being belated, and in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. The old burying ground shares the entrance of the cemetery with Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. Although they are next to each other, they are separate. The old burying ground covers 3 acres and is managed by the Reformed Church of the Tarrytowns.
The parcel of land here was originally owned by Frederick Phillips I, Lord of Phillips Manor. It was part of a much bigger expanse that measured 52,000 acres.
Oh my.
North Tarrytown was originally given the name Slappershaven in 1655 by a Dutch colonist. Kelly, stop laughing about that name. The translation was Sleeper's Haven. And I'm sure if I would have said it with a Dutch accent, it would have sounded better, like Slappershaven or something. Maybe that's what it is, Slappershaven.
It still tickled my funny bone.
Frederick was Dutch, but he swore allegiance to the English when they seized the Dutch colony, and that is how he got his manorship. So you can just see he's like, wait, I'll be on your side. Can I have some land? In 1685, Frederick built a mill, manor house, and the old Dutch church in what had been renamed North Tarrytown. The church was situated at the southern end of a cemetery that had already been established in 1650 and had around 50 burials. Frederick died in 1702 and he was buried in a crypt at the Old Dutch Church.
There are several notable burials here. A former deacon of the church named Wolfert Acker shows up in Washington Irving's A Chronicle of Wolfert's Roost. Wolfert's Roost was his home. Acker was born in Brooklyn and came to Tarrytown and lived as a tenant under Frederick. Even though he was a tenant, he had the second largest home in the region. When he died in 1753, he was buried in the crypt beneath the floorboards, alongside Frederick. Wolfert's Roost was eventually burned down by the British, and part of the land became Washington Irving's, and he built Sunnyside there.
Several residents of what eventually became Sleepy Hollow inspired Washington Irving, and they are buried in the old burying ground. These are Katrina Ecker Van Tessel, Samuel Youngs, and Abraham Martlin. Katrina was a model for Katrina, and the actual Katrina had a C, whereas the one in the Legend of Sleepy Hollow had a K. She died at the age of 56 in 1793 and has a really cool carved headstone featuring a different kind of death's head. This is a round head like a smiley face, only the mouth is curved down, and then there are 2 wings below that. Very different. I've never seen one like that.
Interesting.
Part of the stone has broken away, and the partial epitaph reads, "Time shall end our mourning for so dear a friend." Her Revolutionary War hero husband, Petrus Van Tessel, is buried with her. Samuel Youngs was born in 1760 and became good friends with Irving. He was also a Revolutionary War soldier. He was delighted when Irving used him as a model for Ichabod Crane. When Youngs died in 1839, he was buried here, but later disinterred and moved to Dale Cemetery in Ossining. Abraham Martlin served as model for Brom Bones in the story.
William Paulding Jr. was born in 1770 and served as a brigadier general during the War of 1812. a U.S. representative from New York and mayor of New York City. His estate, Lyndhurst, is just outside of Sleepy Hollow. And we looked this up. OMG, it is breathtaking. It looks like a castle just sitting there on the banks of the Hudson River. The mansion was the backdrop for the movies House of Dark Shadows and Night of Dark Shadows, which were based on Dark Shadows.
Which was the only proper way to make a soap opera.
True. Dirk Storm was born in the Netherlands in 1630 and recorded the first official history of Sleepy Hollow.
And Kelly's going, how am I supposed to say this Dutch thing?
Notie.
It actually had like 10 words, and I went with the little nickname that they give it.
His book, Het Notiet Boek, has 5 parts and is one of the few surviving records of Dutch colonial American village life in English-occupied New York province. He also served as tax collector for Frederick Phillips.
And now a little break for a word about one of our sponsors.
Now we're going to head on over to Delaware, to Wilmington, for the Old Swedes Burial Ground. The Old Swedes Burial Ground is now managed by the Old Swedes Foundation. It's located at 606 North Church Street in Wilmington. The cemetery was established around 1638 after the first Swedish settlers arrived in Delaware. These settlers built Fort Christina and founded the burial grounds. A church was added to the burial ground in 1698. There are thought to be at least 8,000 burials here with around 1,200 tombstones, so clearly the bulk of them are not marked. This is still an active cemetery. Recent archaeological research uncovered artifacts dating from pre-Columbian periods through to the present day, including pottery shards, beads, and hairpins. This means that the Lenape tribe was more than likely here before the Swedes. A home built in 1722 that is known as the Hendrickson House was relocated from Ridley Township in Pennsylvania to here in 1960 and sits near the burial ground. It serves as a museum and office. The oldest burial ground here with a legible stone is for William Vandiver, who died in 1718. Peter Jacquet was an officer during the Revolutionary War. He not only was in every action and skirmish under General Nathanael Greene, but he fought in every military engagement under General George Washington that took place in Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and the eastern states. He was literally everywhere. George McLean was a doctor who went on to be a politician, serving in the Wisconsin Senate. In 1854, he was appointed superintendent to a state insane asylum that was going to be built, but it was delayed for corruption, and he passed in 1855 before it was completed. There are a couple of ancestors of Devil Hatfield, who was part of the Hatfield-McCoy feud, buried here. Thomas Francis Bayard really wanted to be president of the United States. He served 3 terms as a U.S. Senator and then made 3 bids to get the nomination to run for president from the Democrat Party. The closest he got to the presidency was serving as President Grover Cleveland's Secretary of State from 1885 to 1889. Then we'll head on up to Maine, to Kittery Point for their old burial ground.
The old burying ground in Kittery Point, Maine, was also known as the First Congregational Church Cemetery. This is located at 23 Pepperell Road and was founded in 1650. A stone wall surrounds the cemetery and there is an iron gate. There are many 17th century slate tombstones, and many Revolutionary War veterans are buried here. There is a stone here that marks the final resting spot for someone named Remick. The epitaph says, "I've chosen to have my ashes placed here because I revere this ancient cemetery and the historic church across the way by which it is governed. And I've selected the rough boulder which marks this spot because it was found embedded in the trail leading through the woods on my own Sunshine Hill, where I have passed so many happy years, and because my dog Teddy and I have walked over it so often."
I thought that was so cool.
Yeah, it's really sweet.
We've seen some burials where they do have a natural stone that marks it. And I'm like, what a neat idea, especially if it was a stone that actually had some meaning for you. One of the saddest shipwreck stories in this area took place off the coast of Kittery on March 21st, 1876. This was the wreck of the brig Hattie Eaton. The storm created heavy seas and fierce winds, and the ship was pushed towards Garish Island. As the ship was tousled about, the chief's mate was thrown against a wall and his shoulder was dislocated. This made it impossible for him to gain control of the wheel of the ship, and he helplessly watched as the ship was dashed onto the rocks at Sisters Point. Crew members managed to get the chief's mate to shore, but were unable to rescue the rest of the crew when the Hattie Eaton was crushed like an eggshell. The sailors were lost at sea and only a couple of bodies were recovered. The chief's mate was the only survivor. So I think what happened is the crew members went back to get some more of the people, and that was it.
Oh, man.
The residents of Kittery decided to make a memorial for the lost in the old burying ground. A newspaper reported, "The names of the lost are Captain James F. Cook of East Boston, a very worthy and highly respected shipmaster, age 39, who leaves a wife and 2 children. William Fitzpatrick of Ireland, second mate, 32 years. Henry Hartmeyer of East Boston, steward, aged 53. Joseph Albin of Cayenne, who was found stowed away on board after the vessel left Port Spain, aged 21 years. Guess you shouldn't have stowed away on that ship. Peter Botars of Grenada, West Indies, aged 25 years. Jeremiah Stevens of St. Kitts, 20 years. William Brevoire of Tobago, aged 21, the 4 latter seamen. Up to Thursday noon, the bodies of Captain Cook, William Fitzpatrick, second mate, and Jeremiah Stevens, seaman, had been recovered. Captain Cook's remains were sent to his family at East Boston, and the second mate Fitzpatrick and Seaman Stevens were buried at the Congregational Cemetery, Kittery Point, the Reverend Mr. Christie officiating. Down into North Carolina to Beaufort, the old burying ground.
Beaufort is the 3rd oldest settlement in the state of North Carolina. This historic cemetery was established in 1724 and has nearly 500 dead interred here, most from the pre-Civil War era.
I've actually been to this one.
The cemetery was established in 1709 and was deeded to Beaufort in 1731 by a man named Nathaniel Taylor. Several early burials have no markings. The earliest legible one dates to 1756. Buried here is Otway Burns, who served the U.S. government by going after British ships during the War of 1812, and he ended up a naval hero. Colonel William Thompson was a commander of the Carteret County Regiment during the American Revolution. There are also several Civil War veterans. Couple of oddities here. An anonymous British soldier requested that he be buried standing up in his uniform right before he died aboard a ship at the port. That would have been a tough grave to dig.
Yeah, you'd have to get it really deep.
A young girl who was on a voyage coming from England died en route, and she was placed in a keg of rum to preserve her, and she was buried here in the keg and all.
Next, we're going to Massachusetts, to the old burying ground in Brookline. This was also known as Walnut Street Cemetery. It was established in 1717 and was the town's only cemetery for 140 years. Wow, that's a long time to not have another cemetery. Notable burials here include Francis C. Barlow. Barlow was born in 1834 in Brooklyn and became a lawyer and politician and served as a general in the Union Army during the Civil War. He led a brigade at the Battle of Antietam, and they were in the center of fighting on the Bloody Lane. The battle left him with wounds, and a report said of him, "Whatever praise is due to the most distinguished bravery, the utmost coolness and quickness of perception, the greatest promptitude and skill in handling troops under fire is justly due to him. It is but simple justice to say that he has proved himself fully equal to every emergency, and I have no doubt that he would discharge the duties of a much higher command with honor to himself and benefit to the country." Well, I thought very highly of him.
Yes.
He died of Bright's disease in 1896.
Zabdiel Boylston was a doctor who lived from 1679 to 1766. He introduced smallpox inoculation to the colonies. He began with his own family and eventually inoculated 250 people. Boylston had to do all of this in secrecy because the clergy and physicians were opposed to inoculation. Amanda M. Edmond was an American poet and children's writer. Edmond began writing poetry when she was just a kid, and much of her writing came before she was 20. She was only 38 when she died in 1862, and many of her pieces were published posthumously. Also buried here is respected theologian and scholar Barnes Sears, who was a president of Brown University.
Staying in Massachusetts, we have the old burying ground in Stoneham. It was established in 1726. There was once a town center here with a meeting house and school, and the cemetery is the only thing left of that. This was the only cemetery for 100 years in the town. Graves are from 1728 to 1924, and there are 450 markers, and several of them are for founding families of Stoneham.
And again in Massachusetts, we have the old burying ground in Littleton, which was established in 1721 on a narrow strip of land, and it was the only one for 100 years. The cemetery has 340 grave markers dating from 1721 to 1909, although documentary evidence exists for more burials.
And not surprising, we're still going to stay in Massachusetts. Obviously, we have a lot of old burying grounds there since it was the original place of landing. And this one really would be your original old burying ground. This is in Duxbury, and it's more famously known as the Miles Standish Burial Ground. This is the oldest maintained cemetery in the United States, and many of the Mayflower Pilgrims are buried here. Duxbury was settled in 1627 by people from Plymouth Colony, and they built their own meeting house. The cemetery was founded next to the meeting house, and it covers 1.5 acres and was used from 1638 to 1789. This cemetery was then abandoned but reclaimed in 1887 by the Duxbury Rural Society. Captain Miles Standish had been buried here, but no one was sure of the location because many of the early markers were wooden. Any field stones that were used disappeared. Probably used them for building, maybe? I don't know. Standish had been a leader of the Plymouth Militia. A unique burial featuring 2 pyramidal field stones in the center of the old burying ground was thought to belong to Standish. The graves there were exhumed in 1889 under a cloud of controversy. The skeleton of an elderly male and a young woman were discovered, but there was no way to really identify them, so they were reinterred. A substantial memorial was built in the spot nonetheless in 1893. There is a castellated stone wall with cannons mounted on each corner that came from the Boston Navy Yard. 3 large boulders bear the names of Miles Standish, Laura Standish, and Mary Dingley Standish. The Standish gravesite memorial is the most prominent feature here. The oldest carved gravestone in the burial ground is dated to 1897 and belongs to Captain Jonathan Alden. Another burial is for Reverend Ichabod Wiswall, who went to London in 1691 to petition for a new charter for Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth colonies, and this was granted, and the 2 colonies merged. There are around 130 markers in the burial ground. George Soule, I'm not sure, it's Soule, was another passenger on the Mayflower, and his descendants placed a marker in 1971 at the supposed location of his grave. Off to New Jersey to Marlborough, the Old Scots Burying Ground.
The Old Scots Burying Ground is found in Marlborough Township in Monmouth County, New Jersey. This is a fairly small cemetery and only covers about 1 acre. The burial ground was founded in 1685, and no one knows for sure how many people are buried here. But as we can see by all the other cemeteries that are a part of this episode, this is typical of old burying grounds because of either no records or lost records, and grave markers that have been destroyed by the elements. The best guess is around 260.
Which is a lot in 1 acre.
Indeed. Most of the headstones were made from brown sandstone. A tall monument commemorates the first recorded Presbyterian ordination, and this was for Reverend John Boyd, the first pastor of the church here. The monument was created by the J&R Lamb Company. That monument stands 25 feet high and sits in the center of the burial ground. A 5-foot spire that sat atop it broke off in the 1950s. The monument was refurbished in 2002, and the spire was replaced. On one side of the monument, there is an inscription, erected under the supervision of the Synod of New Jersey in 1899 to recognize the good providence of God in planting the Presbyterian Church in this county, and to commemorate the first recorded ordination by a presbytery in the American colonies. The General Presbytery assembling in the Old Scots Meeting House on this ground December 1706 ordained John Boyd, who died August 30th, 1708, and was buried here.
Reverend John Tennant was born in Ireland in 1707 and immigrated to Pennsylvania with his father in 1718. He made his way to New Jersey and preached at both the Old Scots Church and White Hill Church. Tennant was the 3rd pastor of the Old Scots Church. He died in 1732 at the age of 24. He's buried beneath a stone slab, and the inscription reads, "Here lies what was mortal of the Reverend Mr. John Tennant, who quick grew old in learning, virtue, grace, quick finished, well yielded to death's embrace, whose molded dust this cabinet contains, whose soul triumphant with bright seraphs reigns, waiting the time till heaven's bright concave flame, and ye last trump repairs this ruined frame." And then there's something in Latin we aren't going to try to say, but the translation is, "Why should I complain of premature and bitter death? Death came early and life was good."
There are probably a few other old burying grounds that we missed, but these are the better known ones. Clearly, they are all on the East Coast since that is where European settlement started. Most of these burial grounds date back to the 1600s. They are important historically. not only because some of the notable burials within, but because they are a record of how early settlers cared for their dead. Were their traditions different than ours? Perhaps a little. Was their loss the same? Definitely. We hope you get a chance to explore an old burying ground someday and enjoy the stones and bones found there.
Thanks so much for joining us on this Stones and Bones. I've been your host, Diane.
And this has been Kelly.
You take care now.
Bye-bye.
Stones and bones.